Chapter 1. The Apple Fair at Davington Green. It was the sort of Saturday morning that Davington villagers would speak of for weeks afterward, not for the crisp autumn sunshine or the abundance of russet apples, but for what lay among them. The annual Apple Fair had returned to Davington Green, bringing with it stalls piled high with jams, pies, and preserves. Children darted between hay bales. Old men exchanged exaggerated stories beneath the cider tent, and the Women's Institute proudly showcased their fruit displays under bunting strung between oak trees. Among the gathering crowd stood Miss Jane Marple, seated in a folding chair by the scone stall, her blue eyes taking in the scene over her knitting needles. She was not a Davington native. She hailed from St. Mary Mead, some 15 miles off, but was staying the week with her old school friend, Miss Emmeline Carter, whose cottage overlooked the green. Emmeline had declared the fair a dying tradition, but Miss Marple, in her soft-spoken way, had insisted on attending. She had a quiet fondness for the patterns of village life, and fairs, she believed, revealed far more than they concealed. By 11:30, the fair was in full swing. Reverend Gibbons was blessing the harvest table with theatrical solemnity. The vicar's wife was organizing the apple tart competition with tyrannical efficiency, and just behind the cider stand, Farmer Tom Hemsworth's baskets were drawing compliments for their perfectly polished Cox's orange pippins. It was Tom who noticed it first. He had bent down to retrieve a basket tipped by a mischievous spaniel when he froze mid-motion. A long moment passed. Then his voice rang out, uneven and hoarse. "Someone get the constable." Heads turned. Curious. Feet began converging, and from her chair, Miss Marple put down her knitting dot. The commotion built rapidly. Constable Rowntree, whose primary duties generally involved traffic on market days and recovering missing hens, pushed through the onlookers. Red-faced and breathless, the gathered crowd parted around the overturned apple crate and the harvest basket beside it. It was the blood, bright and unmistakable, soaking through the reed slats and staining the crisp hay beneath. That silenced the crowd. Constable Rowntree crouched, hesitated, then lifted the lid. A gasp rippled through the bystanders. Inside, nestled among the apples, lay a man's right hand pale, clean and unmistakably severed. Mrs. Digby, who ran the sweet stall, fainted neatly into her daughter's arms. Old Mr. Beavis began muttering about witchcraft, and Miss Marple, now standing quietly just behind the cider barrel, watched the scene with solemn curiosity. "Don't touch anything," Rowntree barked, though no one seemed inclined to do so. Emmeline Carter pressed to Miss Marple's side, whispering, "Do you suppose it's a pig's hand? A joke, perhaps, for the fair?" Miss Marple, whose gaze lingered not on the hand, but on the apple basket's base, replied softly, "Oh no, Emmeline, that's no pig's hand, and it is no joke." The constable turned, scanning the crowd. "No. One leave. This is now a crime scene. But who?" A voice murmured. A grim possibility settled over the gathering like a fog. The fair, the apples, the sunshine, it all now felt obscenely misplaced, as if a stage play had been rudely halted to reveal a murder behind the curtain. The vicar cleared his throat and began ushering the children away. Behind him, the Women's Institute argued over whether to cancel the judging. Miss Marple remained quite still. The hand had been carefully placed resting on apples, not buried among them. Whoever had done it wanted it found. That was a message. But to whom? And more importantly, Miss Marple thought, from whom? She cast a glance at the nearby stalls, at Tom Hemsworth, now seated and shaking, at young Ivy Gorge, who was biting, her lip so hard it had begun to bleed, and at Dr. Graham Penrose, the newly arrived physician from Bristol, who stood on the green's edge, oddly still-dot as the crowd whispered and constables were summoned from the next town over. Miss Marple gently touched Emmeline's arm. "Would you mind terribly if we stayed just a little longer?" she said. "For heaven's sake, Jane, why?" "Because," Miss Marple replied with a soft smile, "this is going to be quite dreadfully interesting." And with that, the quietest woman on the green turned her full attention to the chaos, her mind already turning through motives, patterns, and that terrible, deliberate hand. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Bunts. By Sunday morning, the Apple Fair had become something of a cautionary tale. What had begun as a cheerful celebration of Davington's orchards now lingered like a half-forgotten nightmare behind every cup of tea and murmured conversation. The hand, yes, the hand had been carefully removed by the county constabulary and taken to the coroner's office in Little Brendel. It was confirmed to be human, severed cleanly at the wrist and mail. Beyond that, no further word had reached the village. The rest was left to the villagers' imaginations, and they proved more than capable of filling in the gaps dot at the Rose and Crown, the village's only public house. Patrons speculated feverishly. Farmer Hemsworth's cider was left untouched on the counter. He hadn't been seen since the discovery, claiming faintness of stomach. At the post office, Mrs. Hemsley declared that it had to be the work of a passing maniac, likely come down from London. And at St. Mildred's Church, Reverend Gibbons subtly shifted the theme of his sermon to divine judgment, a choice that did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat once again in Emmeline Carter's front parlor, gently repairing a pair of Emmeline's lace gloves while sipping weak tea. She listened quietly as Emmeline fretted over the local consequences. Ruined, Emmeline sighed, pacing in front of the fireplace. "The fair's reputation is quite gone," Mrs. Trudgett says her cousin in East Hemsbury has already heard about it, and she's 3 towns away. And as for poor Tom Hemsworth, Miss Marple said gently, setting down her teacup. "Yes, dear, he's taken it terribly. Locked up his farm shop. Says he might never bring his apples to market again. You know, his father once found a drowned fox in the sheep trough and didn't flinch. But this shock does not always follow logic," Miss Marple murmured. "He was the one who found it, after all." "Found it?" "Jane, some are whispering that he placed it." Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. "Are they now?" She rose, smoothing the lines of her cardigan. "I think, Emmeline, dear, I might take a little walk to the vicarage. Reverend Gibbons is sure to have heard more of the details, and vicars, in my experience, are most observant when it comes to human weakness." Emmeline blinked. "But you aren't investigating, are you?" Miss Marple tilted her head, eyes twinkling. "Goodness, no. I'm only observing. One sees so many small things, you know, when one watches quietly enough." The vicarage sat on the edge of Davington Green, flanked by a narrow garden of drooping chrysanthemums and a gnarled yew hedge that hadn't been trimmed in some time. Reverend Gibbons, a man of round face and soft constitution, welcomed Miss Marple in with warm but distracted hospitality. His wife, Ruth, hovered nearby, thin and severe, clutching her shawl like a lifeline. "Terrible business," the Reverend said, ushering Miss Marple into his modest drawing room. "Shocking for the children. I do wish it hadn't happened so publicly." "You mean you wish it had happened in private?" Ruth said sharply from the doorway. He colored. No. I only mean that it's rather upsetting to discover such a thing in a basket of apples. It's biblical, really." Miss Marple sipped the offered tea. "And what are people saying?" "Oh, all sorts of nonsense," Reverend Gibbons said. "Some think it's the gypsies who passed through last week. Others suspect someone from the traveling fair up in Marshcombe. There's even talk that it could be local Imagine that. But really, Jane, no one's missing, no one's reported anything." "No one?" she asked mildly. The vicar hesitated. "Well, not exactly. I mean, there is one odd thing." Ruth Gibbons spoke crisply. "Peter Landrake." Miss Marple turned her eyes on her. "I don't know the name." "You wouldn't," said Ruth, perching on the edge of the piano stool. "He wasn't exactly respectable. Lived out near the quarry road. Did odd jobs. Kept mostly to himself. Came to the pub. Drank. Made a nuisance of himself. Last seen on Thursday. Or was it Friday morning?" Reverend Gibbons frowned. He never stayed in one place long. He once mowed the rectory lawn, but he drank most of his pay before he reached the gate. Yet still no one has seen him? "Not since before the fair," Ruth said. "It's likely he's wandered off again. He always did." Miss Marple murmured. "And this Peter, was he a young man?" "35 or so, I should say," said the vicar. "Tall, thin, heavy-set?" "Thin and weathered," Ruth supplied. "A rough sort. Tattoos." Miss Marple nodded and looked out the window. "And he lived alone?" "Yes," Ruth said, then narrowed her eyes. "Do you think the hand is his?" Miss Marple only smiled, politely. "Oh, I think many things are possible, Mrs. Gibbons. But if no one knows where he is, and he has both hands when last seen, I suppose we can't be sure of anything yet." She rose and dusted crumbs from her skirt. "Thank you both. You've been very helpful." As she walked back along the lane toward Emmeline's cottage, the air tasted of rain, though the sky remained obstinately clear. A distant bell tolled. The hour dot, Peter Landrake. She'd never met the man, but such types were not unfamiliar to Miss Marple. A drifter, tolerated but not liked. The sort of man a village quietly wishes away. Not hated but inconvenient. Invisible until something terrible brings them to everyone's attention. Still, she thought, the hand had not looked like a laborer's. No thick calluses. No cracked fingernails. Whoever it belonged to, they hadn't been someone who worked with shovels or scythes. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted, as they often did, toward the quieter currents of human behavior, resentments, judgments, hidden lives. She had seen more crimes of passion and folly behind lace curtains than any inspector could uncover with a notebook and a loud voice. She paused by the empty cider stall. The bunting above it still flapped merrily in the breeze, cheerful and oblivious. Then she noticed something odd dot near the back of the cider stand, where the grass had flattened into mud from passing boots. A single apple lay untouched, its skin bruised deeply on one side, as though struck against something hard. Odd, she thought. The baskets had all been gathered. She bent to inspect it. Not an important clue, no, but interesting. Interesting indeed that Chapter 3, the man nobody missed by Monday afternoon. The rain had arrived at last, soft, persistent, and oddly comforting to the villagers of Davington, who preferred weather to talk when things became too disturbing. The Apple Fair grounds were empty now, the bunting drooping like a forgotten thought, and the cider barrels quietly removed under Constable Roantree's supervision. The presence of detective from the county too suited men who spoke little, and wrote much only added to the village's nervous hush. The smaller of the two, Inspector Lyle, had stopped by the Rose and Crown, inquiring about Peter Landrake. His tone was polite, but his questions left no doubt. The hand in the basket might have belonged to someone local. It was that possibility which left the residents most unsettled. A killer from outside was frightening, yes, but a killer within that was a different sort of fear altogether. At Miss Carter's cottage, Emmeline peered through the lace curtain, clutching her cardigan as if it might ward off bad news. "They've gone to the quarry road," she said. "Who has?" Miss Marple asked without looking up from her knitting. "The inspector and that Roauntree man. I saw them heading out of the village on foot." Miss Marple counted 4 stitches before replying. "That would be the sensible direction if they're looking for Mr. Landrake. They say the hand was severed cleanly," Emmeline whispered, as though fearing her walls might overhear. "With something sharp. Butchers and farmers have such tools, Jane." "They do indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though so do woodworkers, surgeons, and landscape gardeners." Emmeline blinked. "Are you saying you don't believe it was Landrake's hand?" "I neither believe nor disbelieve, dear. I simply wait until I have something solid to believe in." The quarry road, a narrow track choked with moss and overgrown bramble, had long been regarded as the edge of polite Davington. A few sheds, one abandoned cottage, and the rusting skeleton of a disused lime kiln made up the majority of the terrain. Peter Landrake's hut sat at the far end, its windows boarded haphazardly, and a single rooster tethered to a half-rotted post outside. Inside. Inspector Lyle sniffed. "Filthy." Constable Roantree nodded mutely, notebook in hand. A single mattress lay rolled in the corner, mismatched boots, a cracked enamel mug, a broken watch on the floor. But what drew Lyle's eye was the fire grate filled not with ash, but half-burnt cloth. He crouched. The fibers were blackened, but clearly recent. Shirt sleeves, maybe. One edge had a brass button melted, almost flat. "Burnt clothing," he muttered. "And no sign of Landrake." He stood. "We'll need to canvass. Ask the neighbors what few of them there are. If someone's killed him, they may have carried the body off. But why leave the hand?" Roantree said, "A warning?" Lyle shook his head. "No, too dramatic for a warning. More like theater." News of the burned clothes traveled faster than the constables did. By evening, Mrs. Digby had informed the entire High Street that Peter Landrake had been murdered in his sleep and burned up with his own bedding. Miss Marple, who had stopped by the greengrocer's for some Bramleys, heard 3 variations of the tale before she reached the corner, but it was at Mrs. Linley's tea shop that something new surfaced. "I heard he owed money," said Ivy Gorridge, lowering her voice. She was 19, sharp-tongued, and suspicious of everyone over 30. to Roderick Grant, of all people. That lot don't forget a debt. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Roderick Grant? The solicitor? He calls himself a solicitor. Ivy said darkly, but my cousin says he makes more off private loans than legal work. He lent to Landrake last summer when the water heater exploded. He charged him £8 interest. In Davington, Miss Marple tilted her head. I hadn't. Thought they were acquainted. They weren't, but Roderick doesn't need friendships, just contracts and signatures. At that moment, Mrs. Linley emerged from the back room with a fresh plate of biscuits, beaming at her customers. But Miss Marple, her thoughts elsewhere, made no move for one. Later, as she walked home beneath a gray sky, beginning to bruise with evening, she paused outside the village hall. A poster for the Apple Fair still clung to the notice board, damp and curling. The sponsors listed at the bottom included the Davington Bank, the Women's Institute, and interestingly Roderick Grant & Co., solicitors. How curious, Miss Marple thought. A man so stingy with his pennies, yet generous enough to sponsor. Apple pies. The next morning brought a bitter chill. Miss Marple, always early, found Reverend Gibbons already tending to the small memorial table, now placed on the church steps lily in a vase, a Bible opened to Psalm 91, and a small card that read, "For the departed soul." But we don't know who has departed, Miss Marple said gently as she approached. The Reverend gave a helpless shrug. It felt wrong to do nothing. People are frightened. They want something to hold on to. She nodded. Understandable. Fear, I've always found, drives people more than hatred ever could. He looked at her, surprised. And what do you think drove the person who left that hand in the basket? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Shame, perhaps, or justice. Or a desire to be noticed. Some souls crave notice more than peace. And what do you think happened to Peter Landrake? I think, Miss Marple said, turning toward the churchyard where the grass shimmered with dew, he became the man nobody missed until someone wanted him to be missed quite badly. Later that day, Inspector Lyle arrived with an update. Hand, as suspected, matched Peter Landrake's fingerprints taken once in Bristol for public intoxication. The coroner confirmed the cut was done with precision, possibly post-mortem, and that the man had likely died not more than 3 days before the fair. There was no body yet, but the case had officially become murder, and though no one said it aloud, many in Davington began locking their doors for the first time in years. Chapter 4. The solicitor's smile. By Wednesday morning, the sky over Davington had cleared, as if the rain had washed away the village's unease, at least on the surface. Children were walking to school again. Dogs barked from behind garden gates, and the postman, Mr. Trigg, resumed his cheerful whistling. But behind net curtains and across teacups, the same question pulsed like a hidden current. Who had killed Peter Landrake? At the Rose and Crown, the conversation had grown more subdued. Gossip had started to take on sharper edges. People were no longer speculating wildly. They were naming names, careful ones, spoken in lowered tones. And the name that came up most often, Roderick Grant. Miss Marple, had not yet met the man, though she had seen him in passing. Tall, trim, always impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit that seemed slightly too formal for the village. He had come to Davington 5 years ago, taking over the modest legal practice from a Mr. Darnley, now retired to Eastbourne. Some thought Grant a blessing efficient, modern, discreet. Others called him calculating dot. It was Emmeline who finally introduced them, if rather unintentionally. "I must pop in to see Mr. Grant about that land lease," she said at breakfast, buttering toast with unnecessary force. "He's been putting me off for a month, and I will have an answer today." Miss Marple folded her newspaper. "If it's no trouble, Emmeline, I think I might accompany you. I find legal offices very soothing places. All that quiet order and tidy paperwork." Emmeline gave her a suspicious look. "You're not thinking of questioning him, are you?" "Goodness, no," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "I'm merely tagging along." The office of Roderick, Grant & Co. sat in a squat brick building beside the butcher's, its neat brass plaque gleaming despite the gray mortar. The reception was plain 2 chairs, a hat stand, and a ticking clock. A dark-haired secretary named Miss Lane offered them tea, then showed them into the inner office. Mr. Grant stood behind a mahogany desk, smiling as though he'd just won a game of chess. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, rising to take her hand. "And you must be Miss Marple. I've heard your name more than once this week." Miss Marple smiled. "I imagine nearly everyone's has been mentioned." "True enough," he chuckled, motioning for them to sit. "This dreadful business at the fair unbelievable. I do hope the police are making progress." "I believe they are," Miss Marple said calmly, "though I gather they're still quite interested in Peter Landrake." Grant's smile thinned slightly. "Yes, unfortunate man. I lent him a small sum once. He never paid it back, though I doubt he ever meant to." "You must have many such accounts," Miss Marple observed. "People often turn to solicitors when banks won't listen. Indeed, I consider it a service to the village." He tapped a pen lightly against his notepad. "Though I'm careful, one must be." Emmeline, growing impatient, cleared her throat. "Mr. Grant about the lease. On the Carter parcel." Yes, he said, pulling a folder. "All in hand. Just waiting on a counter-signature from the council. Nothing to concern yourself with." He slid the file across his desk, his expression unchanged. But Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. A faint scratch on the back of his right hand, long and pale. Not fresh, but not old either. She glanced once at his nails. Clean, well manicured, but oddly brittle. The kind of nails that flake under pressure. Grant caught her looking and smiled again, wider this time. "I'm afraid the countryside's not good for the hands, Miss Marple. Thorn bushes, brambles. I've had to hack through my own garden. This week, the roses had practically turned to jumble." "Indeed," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Gardening is rarely as gentle as it seems." Outside, Emmeline let out a frustrated huff. "He's hiding something. I swear it." "Oh, I'm quite certain he's hiding several things," Miss Marple said softly. "You noticed the scratch, didn't you?" "Of course, but it's not the scratch that bothers me. It's the brambles." "Brambles?" "Emmeline, dear, it hasn't been dry long enough for heavy gardening. That rain we had would have made bramble cutting very messy work. So he's lying. I suspect he's misdirecting." They walked in silence for a moment before Miss Marple added, "Tell me, has Roderick Grant ever represented Farmer Hemsworth?" Emmeline blinked. "Tom? I don't know. Why? I noticed something odd at the fairgrounds. An apple bruised on one side and resting quite far from the overturned basket. as if it had been thrown. What does that mean? I don't know yet, Miss Marple said, almost to herself. But bruises on apples and scratches on hands rarely happen alone. They are usually dot reactions. Later that afternoon at the village library, Miss Marple asked the librarian, a tidy woman with excellent recall, for two things: the last known public notice filed by Roderick Grant, and any mention of Peter Landrake in the parish records. Odd request, the librarian said, shuffling through files. But you're not the first to ask about Landrake this week, no? Oh, yes, yesterday Ivy Gorridge came in, asking about him. Wanted to know if he was ever in trouble as a boy. And was he? Not officially, but he was in the old boys group with Richard Penrose, Dr. Penrose's brother. The librarian gave a solemn nod. Died young, poor thing. Fell from the quarry cliffs. Accidental, they said. But it was Peter Landrake who was with him that day. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her bag. She murmured, "How easily the past comes back when the present opens a door." The librarian looked puzzled. "Sorry?" "Nothing," Miss Marple said, her tone as soft as ever. "Just thinking out loud. Thank you very much." As the evening settled over Davington, with its quiet lanes and ivy-covered walls, Miss Marple returned to the Carter cottage with a mind teeming with threads. Some stretched toward Peter Landrake and his debts. Others curled toward Roderick Grant and his charming smokescreens. And now a thread frayed at the edge Richard Penrose. A forgotten boy in a forgotten quarry. She looked out Emmeline's window. At the quiet green, Davington, she thought, was full of lovely things and very well-kept secrets. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Quiet House. The following morning, Miss Marple awoke with the kind of calm certainty that often accompanied her most troubling thoughts. The autumn sun poured in through Emmeline's lace curtains, dappling the carpet with golden light. Somewhere nearby, a milk float rattled past, and the distant chime of the church bell struck 9. She had already decided, over her early breakfast tea, that her next visit must be to the quietest man in Davington, Dr. Graham Penrose. He had been a fixture of the village for just over a year, having returned from Bristol following his mother's passing. Though his qualifications were indisputable and his manner gentle, he remained curiously reserved. The villagers accepted his politeness as a form of good breeding, but Miss Marple recognized another quality: avoidance. There were two types of reserved people in her experience: those who lived within themselves because they were content, and those who did so because they had something to hide. Emmeline was surprised when Miss Marple requested her to telephone the surgery for an appointment. "You're not ill, are you?" "Jane, no, dear, but one must maintain appearances. I shall ask about my joints. They've been very obedient lately, which is suspicious in itself." The surgery was a modest bungalow on Lavender Lane, surrounded by low hedges and a line of tall hollyhocks now past their prime. A discreet sign by the door read Dr. G. Penrose, General Practitioner, in worn gold lettering. Miss Lane, Roderick Grant's secretary, was also there now, doubling as part-time receptionist. In small villages, such overlap was often practical and occasionally revealing. "She's been filling in," Emmeline had explained. "The doctor doesn't trust strangers, you see." Miss Marple entered the waiting room precisely at 11. A boy with a scraped knee and an elderly man with An ear trumpet sat on mismatched chairs, flicking through well-worn magazines. Within minutes, she was called in. The doctor's consultation room was neat, almost obsessively so. Everything on his desk aligned precisely. Notebooks stacked squarely. Pencils sharpened to symmetrical points. The only softness in the room came from the view an open window showing the garden, where a pair of doves picked nervously at the gravel-dot doctor. Penrose stood as she entered. Miss Marple, a pleasure. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with fine, intelligent features and dark circles under his eyes. His hands, folded before him, were pale but strong. "Good morning, Doctor," Miss Marple said, lowering herself into the chair with a slow, deliberate motion. "I'm afraid I've been quite undeservedly well, but one hears that prevention is preferable to cure." He smiled faintly. "I've always agreed with that philosophy." "Your knees, then?" "Yes, though lately I think they've grown too." Pleased with themselves. It makes one suspicious of what might come next. He chuckled lightly and began examining her wrists and fingers. "I must say, it's quite refreshing to have a patient who isn't certain they're dying." "Well," said Miss Marple, "not yet, at least." There was a beat of silence before she added, "You were present at the fair, I believe?" "Briefly, yes," Penrose replied, his tone suddenly more measured. "I'd only just arrived when the when the basket was discovered." "And what did you make of it all?" His hands paused, just for a second. Ghastly business. Not something one expects in a place like Davington. "No," she said mildly, "but human nature doesn't often honor geography. I imagine you've seen quite a range of human suffering. I try not to carry it home with me. But you've lived here all your life, haven't you? Except for Bristol?" "Yes. My family's been here for generations. And your brother Richard, was it? He was in the local school?" Muscle in his cheek twitched. "He died when we were boys. A fall. Tragic accident." "Ah, yes, so I've heard. At the quarry." Penrose's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "You've been asking questions. Only the sort an old lady asks when something disturbs the orchard, Doctor." He sat back slowly, folding his hands once again. "What are you really here for, Miss Marple?" She met his gaze squarely. "To observe. You see, I find that when something terrible happens in a village, it's often the second terrible thing that tells you why the first occurred." There was a long pause. "I didn't kill Peter Landrake," Penrose said, not angrily but flatly, like someone stating the weather. "I never said you did, but you suspect I know something. I suspect everyone in Davington knows something. The question is only what they consider worth hiding." Another silence, and then Penrose rose, walked to the window, and looked out toward the trees beyond his garden. "Richard didn't just fall," he said quietly. "He was pushed. Or perhaps threatened. Peter was there, and they were arguing. Something about a bet, or maybe something worse. I was only 12. I heard the shouting, then the scream. And when they brought Richard's body back, there was never a proper investigation." "You never told anyone this?" "Who would have listened?" Peter said. "Richard slipped. No one wanted to look closer. Least of all our parents." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you still treated Peter at the surgery?" "I treated everyone. That's what a doctor does. But I never forgave him." His voice trembled just once. "Did you confront him?" No, I couldn't. I didn't want the past to take over my life. Miss Marple stood, smoothing the skirt of her dress. The past has a way of knocking on the door when we least expect it. Dr. Penrose turned, his face composed once more. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, but if someone did, I wouldn't mourn. She nodded slowly. That, Doctor, is what worries me. Not mourning often precedes not caring, and that is a very dangerous space. As she walked home, the early afternoon sun filtering through the trees, Miss Marple allowed the threads of the past and present to intermingle in her mind. A dead brother, a guilty companion, a solicitor with a scratch and a debtor with no grave. The puzzle was forming, but one piece perhaps. The most important piece was still hidden in plain sight, and she had a feeling it was about to reveal itself. Chapter 6. The second basket that evening, as twilight descended over Davington, a strange hush settled over the village. It was not the peace of a place at rest, but the quiet of uncertainty of shadows gathering at windows and whispered names muttered between sips of tea. The police had yet to discover Peter Landrake's body. Inspector Lyle's search parties returned with muddy boots and tight lips, and the villagers, lacking facts, began to invent their own. Miss Marple, however, was not content with speculation. She sat alone in Emmeline Carter's parlor, her knitting idle in her lap. A small fire crackled in the grate. The house was quiet. Emmeline had gone to visit her cousin in Lower Barrow. For Miss Marple it was an ideal evening, not for rest, but for remembering Dot. It came back to her slowly, a conversation during the fair. Half overheard while sampling jam, Mrs. Linley had been speaking to young Ivy Gorridge about a missing second harvest basket. Ivy had mentioned it offhandedly, saying she'd seen 2 baskets brought by Tom Hemsworth. Not one, but only one had been found. Miss Marple frowned and stood, retrieving her coat. The Hemsworth farm was not far just beyond the green, near the orchard's edge. Tom, she knew, had kept to himself since the discovery, but she suspected it was not grief that kept him silent. It was guilt of a different sort. The Hemsworth farm was a quiet place after dusk. The hens were already in their coop, and the cows lowed softly in the distance. A dim light glowed in the barn, flickering through gaps in the timber. Miss Marple knocked on the farmhouse door. Then, again, no answered. She turned to leave, then paused. The barn door was slightly ajar. She hesitated only a moment before stepping across the yard, her footsteps muffled by the straw. The barn was warm, thick with the scent of hay and apples, and there, at the far end, near the back wall, stood a second harvest basket, its lid tightly shut. Miss Marple moved closer, noting the broken handle and a faint reddish smear along its edge. Miss Marple? The voice startled her. She turned, to find Tom Hemsworth standing in the doorway, face drawn and flushed, a lantern in his hand. I didn't hear you come in, he said quickly. I knocked, Miss Marple replied gently. I assumed no one was home. He rubbed his neck with a calloused hand. I was in the field. Needed to check the fencing. She nodded toward the basket. This is yours? Tom shifted. It is, old one, meant to throw it out. Yet here it sits. Was it at the fair? A long pause. I took it with me, yes. Meant to use it. But one was enough. Miss Marple approached the basket and lifted the lid. Inside were apples soft and overripe, many bruised. a few beginning to rot, and beneath them, half covered in straw, a folded piece of cloth. She glanced up at Tom, who had gone pale. She removed it carefully. A shirt, torn, blood-stained. Tom swallowed hard. I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple didn't speak. I found it the day after, he went on, voice cracking, buried under some loose straw in my cart. Someone had hidden it. I didn't see anything at the fair, I swear. But when I found that dot and the apples, I panicked. Why didn't you tell the police? I thought, what if they think it was me? I was the one who found the hand, weren't I? And Peter, well, he and I never got along. Miss Marple gently refolded the shirt. Tom, do you know whose shirt this is? He shook his head. Not mine, and not Peter's. Too fine. More like something a gentleman would wear. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. And no one else has been in your barn? No drifters, no deliveries? No, ma'am. Only the vet last week for the calf. And maybe Doctor. Penrose did stop by on Wednesday. Brought me some liniment. She blinked. Did he go near your cart? I don't recall. He was only here 5 minutes. Miss Marple walked back through the orchard in silence, the wind rattling the trees like dry bones. The shirt had been hidden intentionally. Someone had used Tom's basket, his cart, as a delivery mechanism, knowing the man wouldn't check until it was too late. But why plant the hand there? Why frame someone at all? She stopped abruptly, unless the frame was not the end, but the distraction. A public spectacle at the fair, the hand discovered. The attention pulled entirely toward Tom Hemsworth, while something else, something vital, was taken away. Under the cover of panicked Dot, she turned and began walking faster. Back at the cottage, she found Emmeline returning with a tin of shortbread and a fresh round of gossip. You'll never believe this, she said, breathless. Roderick Grant, he was in Bristol that weekend, the day before the fair. Someone saw him on the train. Why would a man go to Bristol when he claims to be trimming roses? Perhaps to visit someone, Miss Marple said softly. Who? A brother, perhaps, or a doctor? Emmeline blinked. But he doesn't have a brother. Miss Marple moved to the fire and gazed into the embers. No, she said, but Peter Landrake did. She slept little that night. Her mind turned over images, a severed hand, a burned shirt, a basket placed in plain sight. The lies were beginning to wear thin. Someone had been counting on the village to focus on shock and scandal, on what was found, but Miss Marple was far more interested in what was missing, and soon she suspected something long buried perhaps as far back as Richard Penrose's. Fall would rise to the surface. Chapter 7. Apples and ashes the following day broke chill and gray, with clouds hanging low over Davington's rooftops like an unspoken warning. The wind had shifted colder, sharper, and seemed to carry with it a murmur of unfinished business. The church bells rang twice for a morning funeral no one could name, and the postman, Mr. Trigg, delivered letters in silence for the first. Time and years, Miss Marple stood in Emmeline's garden with her hands folded lightly at her waist, watching the clouds gather. Her thoughts were heavy with questions that had started to settle into place, like seeds in well-tilled soil. But still, one vital piece eluded her, the why, the motive beneath the performance, the reason for the hand, the basket, and the second shirt, hidden not in panic, but with care. She needed to speak to someone who understood the village not as it was now, but as it had been. And so she set out for the tea shop. Mrs. Linley was bustling between tables when Miss Marple entered, her cheeks flushed and her apron dusted with flour. The shop was quiet. Only old Mr. Beavis sat by the window, sipping his usual with a trembling hand. "Jane, dear," Mrs. Linley said with a tight smile. "Horrid weather for October. What can I get you?" "Only your company, if you can spare a moment." Mrs. Linley blinked, then untied her apron and sat down across from her, eyes wide with curiosity. "You've lived here a long time, Miss," Marple said. "I wonder if you remember a boy named Richard Penrose." Mrs. Linley's expression darkened. "Lord, yes. Sweet child, always polite, always a bit ... distant, if you understand me." "I do. It broke poor Mrs. Penrose when he died. And that Peter boy, he was never quite the same afterward. Drifted after that. Some thought he blamed himself." "Did he say anything after the accident?" "Not to me, but I heard whispers. That he'd been drinking that day. That they argued. But boys will argue, won't they? It doesn't mean ... well. It doesn't mean someone meant harm." Miss Marple looked down at her teacup. "Was there ever any suspicion of foul play?" "Oh, heavens no," said Mrs. Linley quickly. "People don't want to look too closely. At accidents, it makes them uncomfortable." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And what of the Penrose family? Did they have ... enemies?" Mrs. Linley hesitated. "The father did. He was headmaster once, years ago. Strict, cold, too cold. Expelled a boy for stealing from the church fund. Publicly, too. The poor thing moved away with his mother shortly after. That family was never quite welcome again. Do you remember the boy's name?" Mrs. Linley frowned. "Lewis, that was it. Gerald Lewis. Quiet, smart, but always watching, like he was waiting for something." Miss Marple made a quiet mental note that it was not the name she had expected. She returned to Emmeline's cottage just as a knock came at the door. Emmeline opened it to find Constable Rowntree, looking flustered and slightly damp. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding respectfully. "Inspector Lyle asks if you'd be willing to come down to the station. We've found something." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? Have you found Mr. Landrake's body?" Rowntree hesitated. "We've found remains, madam, in the fire pit behind the Penrose property. The Davington station was no grand place, just 2 rooms, a desk, and a lamp that flickered when it rained. But that day it felt as solemn as a courthouse." Inspector Lyle stood near the stove, hands in his pockets, as Miss Marple was shown in. "Miss Marple," he said without ceremony, "we've located burned bones, ash fragments, and what looks to be a melted belt buckle. The coroner confirms they're human, likely adult male. It matches the timeline." "Peter Landrake," she said simply. He nodded. "We believe so, but it's the location that troubles me." "You found it behind Dr. Penrose's home?" "Yes, hidden under some fresh turf. Someone wanted it covered, but not buried. The fire was hot enough to destroy most identifying features, but not the deeper fragments. It was deliberate, controlled." Miss Marple sat down quietly. "You believe Dr. Penrose did this?" "I believe someone used his property to do it. He claims he didn't know about the fire, but neighbors recall smoke late Friday evening, and no one asked." "Not in this village." People mind their business until it becomes a spectacle. Miss Marple tapped a finger against her purse. Inspector ... May I ask something odd? Certainly. Was anything missing from the fire? Lyle blinked. Missing? A fire. That hot, that deliberate, that carefully done. It was meant to destroy, but it left a hand. He leaned forward. Go on. If you wanted someone gone, truly gone, you wouldn't leave anything behind. But this killer left the most identifying. Piece of all, a signature almost, which means they didn't want Landrake to vanish. They wanted him discovered. Lyle frowned. But they hid the body only after using it, Miss Marple said. The hand was a message. It pointed us away from the real fire, and whoever planned this was counting on us to stop looking. Once we found it, there was a long pause. Then Lyle murmured, so the fire was the real crime, and the basket was just a curtain rising. Miss Marple left the station just before dusk, her coat pulled close. Her walk back took her past the edge of the village, where the trees deepened and the air grew colder. She passed the empty green. The cider stand, now dismantled, and paused by the old churchyard dot there. Amid the leaning stones stood a fresh plot, no headstone yet, just a marker. She read it. Peter Landrake in memory. It wasn't official. Likely placed by someone who had no other way to mourn him. She bent slightly and brushed a fallen leaf from the name. Then, behind her, a voice spoke. You've been asking questions, Miss Marple. She turned to see Ivy Gorge arms crossed, eyes red-rimmed but defiant. I suppose I have, Miss. Marple said gently. And what would you like to say? Ivy looked at the grave. He didn't deserve it. Not like that. He wasn't a good man, but he wasn't that bad. Who was he to you? Ivy's chin trembled. No one. But her. Voice cracked. Miss Marple stepped closer. Dear child, no one never weeps like that. Ivy swallowed hard. I told him not to push. I told him the past would eat him alive. He wouldn't listen. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He remembered something, didn't he? Something from long ago, and someone made sure he wouldn't talk. Ivy. Ivy didn't reply, but she didn't deny it either. As the evening bell tolled over the church tower, Miss Marple knew one thing. The curtain had lifted. The performance had begun, and the real killer was not done yet. Chapter 8. Ashes on the ledger the following morning. Miss Marple paid a visit to the most meticulous man in Davington, Mr. Alfred Bream, the village clerk. His office, tucked into a side room in the parish hall, smelled faintly of mildew and ironed linen. Ledgers lined the wall in alphabetical precision, and the brass clock on the shelf ticked so loudly it seemed to hold time hostage. Miss Marple, unbothered by its menace, sat patiently across the polished desk while Mr. Bream adjusted his spectacles and leafed through a file marked P. I do apologize for the delay, Miss Marple, he said with his usual nervous energy. The Landrake files rarely consulted. The man wasn't much for official matters. No trouble at all, she said pleasantly. I'm merely following up on a small curiosity. I understand Peter Landrake once signed a debt agreement with Mr. Roderick Grant? Yes, here it is. Bream tapped a yellowed page. A private arrangement. £10 borrowed, to be repaid within 6 months. Signed last June. And did he repay it? Bream hesitated. Partially. £5, according to the note scrawled in the margin. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And the margin note was at Mr. Grant's hand? I believe so. Does that sort of side notation stand as legal proof? Technically, yes, though it's always best practice to initial such notes, which you'll see he did not. Miss Marple studied the page. The handwriting was firm and slanted, but something about the ink gave her pause. It was darker than the signature above it, fresher. Do you happen to know, she said slowly, when this copy was last reviewed? Breen squinted at the ledger. Not since last summer. August. I believe. Miss Marple closed the folder gently. Thank you, Mr. Breen. You've been very helpful. As she stepped out into the weak sunlight, she glanced at the file once more in her mind. There was a second page beneath the loan agreement. A document with Peter Landrake's signature again, this one from years earlier. A witness line unsigned. A name mentioned. Richard Penrose. She would return to it soon. But first, she needed to revisit someone far less tidy. She found Ivy Gorge on the footpath behind the church, tossing crumbs to the birds. Ivy looked up, startled, but said nothing. Miss Marple sat beside her on the mossy bench, folding her gloved hands. I imagine it was quite a burden, she said softly, carrying his memory, especially once he began asking questions. Ivy bit her lip. He thought someone owed him something. He said he'd stayed quiet long enough. Was it about Richard Penrose? Ivy gave a short, bitter laugh. Everything in this village leads back to Richard Penrose. You'd think he was royalty. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did you know him? I was a child when he died. My brother told me stories. How Richard was clever but cruel. How he liked to toy with people. And how Peter always followed, always obeyed, even when it made him sick with guilt. And what did your brother think? Ivy hesitated. That Peter didn't push him, but he didn't stop it either. And when Peter came back recently, that guilt had started leaking out. He drank more, talked too much, said he'd seen something that could ruin everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did he say who it would ruin? Ivy nodded faintly. He said Roderick Grant wasn't who people thought he was. That he'd changed his name, that he wasn't just a solicitor. He was involved. Miss Marple's breath caught. Involved in what? But Ivy shook her head. He didn't say, only that it had something to do with that day at the quarry. Miss Marple returned home in time to intercept the postman. Among the circulars and bills, she found what she'd requested, a copy of the school's disciplinary, records from 1991, a modest folder, neatly clipped. She read quickly, her eyes pausing on one name, Gerald Lewis, expelled, accused of theft. Witness listed, Richard Penrose. Further comment, report supported by peer Roderick Grant, formerly Gerald Lewis. Her eyes widened. There it was, a change of name, a boy humiliated and cast out, a grudge buried under years of silence. Miss Marple sat very still. So that was the link. Roderick Grant, born Gerald Lewis. He had once been the scapegoat for Richard Penrose. The village had forgotten, but Peter Landrake had not. And now, with Peter's drunken recollections threatening to resurrect the truth, Roderick had struck. But it wasn't just about silencing a man, it was about erasing the past and making sure No one could link Gerald Lewis to Davington again. That afternoon, Emmeline returned with a slice of news. "Dr. Penrose has closed his surgery," she said breathlessly. "Put up a sign. Family emergency. Packed a bag, apparently." Miss Marple's lips tightened. "It's not him." "What do you mean?" "It's not the doctor. He's grieving an old brother. But our killer is hiding behind that grief." She rose. "Come, Emmeline, I believe it's time I paid Mr. Grant another visit." Roderick Grant greeted her with a strained smile. He looked thinner, paler, but no less composed. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I wanted to clarify something," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "About Peter Landrake's debts." He closed the door. "I've said all I can to the authorities." "Yes," she said calmly, "but not to me." He hesitated. "Why should I?" "Because you've lied once already," Miss Marple said, setting her bag gently on a chair. "About your past. About your name. About your involvement in the school scandal that expelled Gerald Lewis and left Peter Landrake holding secrets that were never his to carry." For the first time, Roderick's face changed. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. "Don't know what you mean," he said, but the voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I think you do." Gerald Lewis vanished, and Roderick Grant appeared, a man with a fresh name, a clean profession, and enough charm to make the village forget. But Peter remembered, and Peter talked. And that, Mr. Grant, was something you could not allow. He was still for a long time. Then he said very softly, "You can't prove anything." "No," she said, "but you already did, when you left the hand." He turned sharply. "What?" "You wanted him found. You wanted the village to remember Peter Landrake not as a victim, but as a warning. So you framed Tom Hemsworth, burned the rest, and hoped no one would look back far enough to find the boy you once were." Silence stretched between them. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "And you really ought to have initialed that margin note in the ledger. It might have passed unnoticed, but the ink is quite a different shade. Rather foolish for a solicitor." Grant took one step back. "You're bluffing," Miss Marple smiled. "I rarely bluff." "It's Wraith." Unbecoming in an old lady. She turned and walked to the door. "Good day, Mr. Grant. I suspect the inspector will want a word with you very soon." As she stepped back onto the lane, the breeze lifted Dot. The village still looked the same quaint, sleepy, sun-dappled, but something had shifted Dot and Miss Marple as ever, had simply noticed that Chapter 9. A game of shadows. It was late afternoon by the time Inspector Lyle received Miss Marple's written note, passed discreetly through Constable Rowntree with all the gravity of a legal summons. Inside the envelope plain, cream-colored, with her neat handwriting, was a single line. "I believe you will find the name Gerald Lewis quite relevant to your inquiries. Roderick Grant may not be who he claims." Attached was a copy of the school disciplinary record. Lyle read it twice, his brow knitting deeper with each pass. When he finally looked up from the page, the corners of his mouth tugged downward, not in surprise, but in tired recognition. The pieces were beginning to align. The performance, as Miss Marple had called it, was now well underway. Dot by evening, Roderick Grant's office was officially closed until further notice. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned to Emmeline's parlor, her eyes more tired than usual, her steps slower, but her mind, sharp as ever, was still chasing the final threads. The motive was now clear, the means largely accounted for, but there remained something unsettled, something that hadn't yet clicked into place. She turned the pieces over once again as Emmeline poured tea and rattled on anxiously. "It's been a whirlwind, Jane. The whole village is talking. They say the inspector came knocking at Roderick Grant's cottage with 2 constables just after 4 o'clock. Took documents, files, even his office typewriter." Miss Marple stirred her tea without tasting it. "And Ivy Gorge has disappeared." That caught Miss Marple's attention. Emmeline nodded. "Mrs. Linley said she never came to clear her shift at the tea shop this morning. Her room's empty. Her bag's gone." Miss Marple sat straighter, her expression sharpening. "Why would Ivy run?" she murmured. "Now that the truth is surfacing? She was afraid of Roderick, wasn't she?" "Yes," Miss Marple said slowly, "but not only of him. Ivy wasn't just a witness. She was entangled." Emmeline frowned. "You think she helped him?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I think she helped Peter, which means she might know where the rest of him is buried." That night, Miss Marple ventured out alone. The village green was empty, the air cold and still, the last light fading behind the trees in thin bands of copper and gray. She walked toward the orchard, past the site of the old cider stand and the heap of splintered apple crates. Her steps were deliberate, her cane tapping softly against the gravel path. When she reached the gate behind Hemsworth's barn, she paused. It was UNLATCHED. And beyond it, in the far corner of the orchard, a small lantern glowed like an ember. Someone was there. Miss Marple approached slowly, careful not to startle. As she neared the trees, she saw Ivy kneeling in the dirt, eyes red, hands caked with soil. A shallow hole yawned before her. A bundle wrapped in canvas lay beside it. Miss Marple spoke gently. "You should have come to me." Ivy jerked upright, startled, then sagged with resignation. "I didn't know what to do." "I imagine Peter asked you to hide it," Miss Marple said quietly, stepping closer. "The shirt, the papers, the rest of what Roderick didn't want found." Ivy nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He was going to the police. He'd written it all down. Names, dates, even a confession about the fight with Richard. He wanted to make it right. But he never got the chance." Ivy looked away. "He left it with me. Said if anything happened, I should give it to someone. I trusted, but I waited too long." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "That's the trouble with fear. It asks us to wait until it's too late." She knelt, knees creaking, and helped lift the bundle. The canvas was damp, but the contents intact. A small notebook bound with string, 2 folded pages signed in Peter's shaky scrawl, and a cracked photograph. 3 boys at the edge of the quarry, arms over shoulders, smiling tightly. Peter, Richard, and Gerald Lewis. Miss Marple stood again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Ivy. This is what the inspector needs, and what Peter hoped would survive." Ivy looked at her with hollow eyes. "Will it matter now?" Miss Marple placed a hand on her arm. "It always matters when the truth is told." The next morning, Inspector Lyle met Miss Marple at the police station. His manner was more respectful now, less dismissive. She handed him the canvas bundle without ceremony. "He intended to speak," she said, "but fear and old shame closed in." Lyle opened the notebook and read the first few lines. His jaw tightened. "This will be enough," he said. "And Ivy? We'll keep her name clear. She's not a criminal. She's a girl who tried too late." Miss Marple nodded, her work nearly done. But as she turned to go, Lyle said, "There's one more thing." She paused. "We found Roderick's real birth certificate, Gerald Lewis, and we found something else in the Penrose garden." "What?" "A key, wrapped in a piece of old shirt, buried shallow." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "A key to what?" Lyle glanced down at the notebook in his hands. "We're not sure yet, but I suspect you are." She gave a small, knowing smile. Likely to a lock he thought no one would ever open. But keys have a habit of turning themselves ... eventually. That evening, Emmeline placed an extra log on the fire and brought out the shortbread tin. "I still can't believe it," she muttered. "Gerald Lewis, all this time living among us as Roderick Grant." Miss Marple, curled in her favorite chair, simply sipped her tea. "Do you think he planned it all those years ago? The name change, the legal career?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I think he fled and then reinvented himself. It's a common tale, really, but Peter remembered. And when he came back, drunk on regret and half-truths, he threatened to shatter that new identity. And that," she said, "was a crime Roderick could not forgive." They sat in silence for a while, Then Emmeline asked, "What will happen to Ivy?" "She'd go away, I expect. Start again. Girls like her survive because they learn when to disappear." "And you, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I'll stay. Someone has to keep watch over the apples and the ashes." Chapter 10. The quiet reaping a week later, Davington had returned outwardly to something resembling normal. The market stalls reopened. Mrs. Linley's tea shop resumed its full hours. The children once again ran through the orchard lanes without, glancing over their shoulders. But something in the rhythm of the village had changed ever so slightly. The sort of shift that lingers beneath the surface, like frost beneath the soil. In the Rose and Crown, the regulars no longer mentioned Peter Landrake by name. Roderick Grant's brass plaque had been removed from the solicitor's door. No one inquired. No one defended. And at St. Mildred's Church, Reverend Gibbons added a few lines on justice and grace to his Sunday sermon, though he never once looked up as he said them. Miss Marple sat once more beneath Emmeline's rose trellis, knitting a new scarf for the vicar's wife, who had finally admitted to a persistent draft. In the pulpit, Emmeline brought out tea and a letter with a red wax seal. "From the inspector," she said, handing it over. "I expect it's an official thank you." Miss Marple opened it with care. Inside was a brief note from Inspector Lyle. The notebook was all we needed. The handwriting, the signed witness account from the school, the ledger inconsistencies. It's enough. Gerald Lewis, alias Roderick Grant, is being formally charged with premeditated murder and fraudulent concealment of identity. Ivy Gorridge has been placed under protective supervision. She's safe. I thought you'd want to know that, above all. You were right, Miss Marple. The truth did survive. Lyle, she folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. Her eyes remained on the roses, swaying gently in the breeze. "You were quiet for a moment," Emmeline said. Miss Marple smiled. I was thinking of Richard Penrose. Oh, yes. So many people built a shrine to his memory, a tragedy that dulled over time. But I think deep down, the village always sensed it hadn't been fully explained. It hung like damp laundry something, never quite aired. Emmeline poured the tea. And now? Now it's finished, said Miss Marple. Not mended, not made right, but finished. 2 days later, Ivy Gorridge left Davington on the early morning train. She carried one suitcase and a small envelope of savings gathered quietly by the women of the Women's Institute. No one stopped her. No one waved. But in the tea shop window, a single card had been left for Ivy, the girl who remembered, when everyone else forgot. She never returned to Davington. Years later, Miss Marple would hear of a young woman in Devon who ran a home for children with no one to claim them. She smiled softly when she heard the name. Some wounds become roots. And Ivy, like so many girls before her, had chosen to grow something from the dot at the edge of the orchard. Near the place where the second basket had been found, a new tree was planted that autumn, a Cox's orange pippin. Beside it, a small wooden plaque, Peter Landrake. In the end, he told the truth. Most villagers passed it without notice, but Miss Marple visited it once before returning to St. Mary Mead. She stood alone beneath the gold-turning leaves and placed a single apple beneath the roots, not as a tribute, but as a symbol of what had nearly been lost and what had, in the Kun, been found. As the train pulled from Davington Station, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting bag and a paperback Ephemeral Philosophy by her side. The truth, she reflected, was rarely about facts. It was about patterns of guilt, of silence, of the need to belong. Roderick Grant had tried to remake himself through lies, but the past, like a stubborn weed, had rooted itself too deep. And Peter, though flawed and frightened, had finally dug it up. Some crimes wore no masks, but others like this one were cloaked in respectability, good tailoring, and the illusion of importance. And yet, in the end, it had all unraveled not through force or fingerprint, but through quiet questions, keen observation, and a woman. No one ever truly noticed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She preferred it that way.